Greetings and salutations, my fellow YouTubers. I am Apdarkness905. Most of you will not have heard of me, as this is my first video on YouTube. I've been watching and listening to YouTube videos for a number of years now, but had never really had much motivation to do one on my own, because I was more or less content just to be a casual observer and watch what everybody else was doing. However, this is an issue on which I can no longer remain silent, and that issue is this. As the title here indicates, I want to talk about saving Doctor Who from itself because, well, I'm sorry, I'm not going to sugarcoat this, but the current series Doctor Who, well, it sucks, really. It completely and totally sucks. It is crap. You know, it's shallow and superficial. It favors style over substance, and is frankly incredibly lazily written. It's like it's become a parody of the classic series, as though they took the concept of the special of Doctor Who, The Curse of Fatal Death, and applied that to the mainstream series without realizing that A Curse of Fatal Death was a parody. It wasn't meant to be taken seriously, and yet it's what they seem to have done. Whether that was their intention or not, it doesn't change the fact that they've made the current series a parody, a very unfunny joke. And also, when I say the current series, I don't just mean the current series since Peter Capaldi took over as the Doctor, or Stephen Moffat for that matter. No, what I mean is the entire series going all the way back to its beginnings in 2005. Like, I remember on the 26th of March of that year when the first episode, Rose, premiered. When it was over, to this day I can remember the words that came out of my mouth, which were, "What the hell was that? I could pull a better Doctor series out of my ass!" Now, I was speaking figuratively, of course, but that is genuinely how I felt at the time. I felt that, my God, they made a mess of it. They've ruined it. And now the question is, has that opinion stayed steadfast over the years? Well, obviously I couldn't do a better Doctor series as I am, because I'm not a producer at the BBC. But if I had been in Rusty Davies's position and had the money, backing and resources that he had, or by some miracle I became a producer of the BBC tomorrow and had been given the right Doctor Who, then frankly, yes, I think I could have done a much better job. I also remember wishing many times over these long, grueling years that Doctor Who's been languishing in this mediocre hell that's been confined to, that they could have gotten a writing team of a caliber similar to what the original series had, the classic series had, like people like Terrence Dicks or Robert Holmes, both of which were amazing writers, and they did a fantastic job on Doctor Who. And not someone else who could have worked wonders on Doctor Who, who sadly is no longer with us and never actually worked on Doctor Who, but he was an amazing writer, was Nigel Neal. Now, for those of you who don't know who Nigel Neal is, Nigel Neal was a writer for the BBC and later on for ITV. And over his career, he created some of these incredible works of science fiction and occult drama. Like, they were amazing. Like, he did the Quatermass stories, which, if you've never heard of Quatermass, or the character Bernard Quatermass, and his subsequent adventures, then I highly recommend you check him out, because his character is a staple of British science fiction. He also wrote the Beast drama, which was a wonderful suspense series for ITV. He also wrote the Stone Tapes and various other sci-fi and occult dramas over the years. And every time he worked, he was good. Every time he wrote something, it was just absolutely peerless. And that's what we needed for the current series. We needed someone of that same caliber. Unfortunately, we didn't get it. Because when Rusty Davies and his writing did their revival, they were unable to bring the show back on the air without corrupting it. And that tells me one thing, that they were the wrong people for the job. And sadly, it kind of says something about the fans, really, because, what's wrong with us? We were so desperate to have Doctor Who back, we were willing to settle for an inferior product, just take whatever it was they shoved in our faces? Because I sure as hell am not. If anything, I think all the time it was waiting for the show to come back during its hiatus is all the more reason for demand upon the very best that they could possibly do. And frankly, if this was the best that Rusty Davies and his writing team could do, then all that does is prove what I've just said is true. That they were ill-suited for this task, and they had no business being anywhere near the series in the first place. Now, I'm aware of and accept that this opinion is not without bias. I mean, I am a huge fan of the classic series. I have a deep love and respect for it, and I do feel that the current series has pretty much besmirched that and made a mockery of it. So yes, this opinion is biased. I'm aware of that. But it is also not without foundation. Because the fact is, the current series has made one mistake after another. And things haven't gotten better. If anything, they've only gotten worse as the show's progressed. Whereas most TV shows, usually the beginning of the series sucks, and they gradually get better at what they do as they go on. It's like as if this current series Doctor Who is going in reverse. It started off bad, and now it's gradually devolved into terrible because of all the mistakes that have been made. So, what are those mistakes? Well, that's what I'm going to go into now. For a start, the emphasis of the current series is all wrong. Because with each season, they tend to focus on an overarching story point, which I've got nothing against in principle. I mean, that's been shown to work in many series, both in the past and recently. But the problem with the way they do it in Doctor Who is they spend too much time focusing on the bigger picture and not enough time focusing on the individual episodes or adventures that make up the bigger whole. So it's like they rush it out there really quickly, and they don't take the time or the effort to allow the individual adventures to blossom into a full-blown Doctor Who story. And this is a major problem, really, because the original series never did that. Each individual adventure was very well thought out, very meticulously planned, and it was extremely entertaining to watch them. And that's something that Doctor Who is sadly lost, and I think needs to regain. And then there's, of course, the fact that the series emphasis on the Doctor himself. Now, I am aware of the fact the story is called Doctor Who, and it is about him, about Time Lord, the Chosen of Time and Space. That's granted, that's a given. But the problem is they focus too much on him, and it's gone to the point where, like, every character, ally or adversary, is obsessed with his every word and syllable. And this is not a good way to structure a good Doctor Who story. Like, if you want a good example of how you structure a good Doctor Who story, just look at some of the original series, like particularly the adventures during the Terrance Dicks, Robert Holmes pairing during the Fourth Doctor's reign. Like, for example, you had the Terror of the Autons, which introduced not only the Master, the Doctor's arch nemesis, but also the staple members of the unit crew. Like, you had Joe Grant and Sergeant Benton and Captain Mike Yates, and of course the Brigadier. But the Brigadier had been introduced many years before in a storyline called the Web of Fear, which is also is a fantastic story. That one is brilliant. And then, of course, there's later on when Philip Hinchcliffe took over, and he delivered some fantastic stories too. Like, we get things like the Pyramids of Mars, the Terror of the Zygons, the Genesis of the Daleks, the Talons of Wang Chiang, the Seeds of Doom, the Sunmakers, all of these fantastic, brilliant adventures. And then, of course, when Philip bowed out and Douglas Adams took over, we got a new set of really brilliant adventures. Like, First, we had the Key to Time saga, which introduced Romana, who was the first Time Lord companion the Doctor had had in the TARDIS since Susan. And then, of course, you had the City of Death later on, and, of course, Sharda. Now, I know Sharda was never produced, but still, it's an incredible story. It is amazing. And then we had John Nathan Turner took over, probably the most prolific producer Doctor Who had ever had, and he gave us adventures like The Keeper of Traken and later on Logopolis, both of which in my opinion, were fantastic adventures. Like, Logopolis is an all-time favourite of mine, probably because it was the fourth Doctor's last adventure, and I love the fact that he went out on such a really fascinating and strong story. Like, it was incredible. And then later on, when the Fifth Doctor came along, we have adventures like The Visitation, Earthshock. You know, that's just two examples of really good adventures during John Nathan's time. And then, of course, there was the Sixth Doctor. And we had adventures like the Two Doctors, Attack of the Cybermen, Vengeance on Varos. And we also get the Trial of a Time Lord saga, which I know a lot of people don't like Trial of Time Lord, but personally, I think it's fantastic. And it's another reason why I love the fact that it was Colin Baker's last adventure, because just like Tom Baker, he went out on a really high note, I think. And so, you know, basically, that is brilliant, in my opinion. And then we have the Seventh Doctor adventures. Now, sadly, as we all know, the Seventh Doctor's era was not exactly the best for Doctor Who. It didn't have that many really great adventures, I'm sorry to say. But it's not to say that it was completely devoid of good stories. Like, for example, there was Remembrance of the Daleks, which is an all-time favourite of mine. And another one I really enjoyed was Ghostlight. Now, Ghostlight was just incredibly fascinating. I must admit, even to this day, I still don't quite understand what the story's about. But it still is a really good example of what Doctor Who can be when you think outside the box and really try something new and original and just take it to incredibly imaginative areas, which the current series has kind of forgotten how to do. So if you want an example of how to do structured good Doctor Who stories, just look at those adventures. Those are prime examples of how it can be done. And the next problem we come to is the sad fact that the quality of the enemies in the monsters in the current series have gone way, way downhill. Like, I can't actually think of any off the top of my head that are really worth mentioning, because I think it's fair to say that that Doctor Who would be nothing without its memorable monsters, and the current series haven't produced any that are all that memorable. And as if that wasn't enough, the modus operandi seems to be shamelessly to revive classic enemies and classic monsters and immediately set about trying to drag them down to the current series standards, which is sadly extremely lacking. Like, for example, you see this? This is Silurian, right? That's Silurian. This is also a Silurian. Okay? Hell, even this would have been a fairly cool version of Silurian, other than what they ended up actually handing out to us, which was this, which is not a Silurian in any way, shape, or form. It is not. And then we come to the new pacing and format of the show, which is frankly absurd, because they only have a 45-minute long time frame which to squeeze a whole Doctor Who adventure into, which admittedly is not entirely the showrunner's fault, but the fact that they don't apply that time better to tell the story more efficiently and more effectively is most certainly their fault. And don't even get me started on Torchwood. In fact, I'm not even going to talk about Torchwood in this. I'll just focus on Doctor Who for the moment. I will do another video which does talk about Torchwood and the fact that it is a complete and utter waste of time, and also my thoughts on the idea of a Doctor Who spin-off. I'll do another video and leave the link to it in the description for this video, so you can check that out if you want to. But in this particular presentation here, I'll just focus on Doctor Who. Anyway, where was I? Oh yes. Well, I think I've pretty much made my point there. I mean, I think that there are many other problems in the current series, but if I went into every single one of them, we'd be here forever, and I don't really want to do that. I don't want to get into that, and so I'll just leave that, because those are the most severe problems as far as I can tell. They're the ones that have caused the most damage and really tarnished the reputation and the legend of Doctor Who. So from that, we go from the problems to, well, what do we do about those problems? What solutions are there? And, well, in my opinion, there's only one solution that would make any difference of any real significance at this point. And that is this. Yep, here it is, the infamous R word, reboot. Now, I'll confess, I don't always approve of the use of reboots in cinema or television, but I think there are some circumstances where they are absolutely warranted. I think this is one of them, because from what I can see, the current series of Doctor Who has gotten itself so deeply embedded in the situation that it's in that there's no other way out of it, really. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. It's probably it's too harsh or too drastic, and then there are other ways of doing it, like maybe you could hire a new writing team to take it a new direction, but I'll tell you why that wouldn't work, and that's because the bad decisions and mistakes and problems of the current series have become part of the tapestry of Doctor Who, and therefore, whatever new direction another writing team would take them in, those issues would be carried over. And so what you end up with there is a cowardly band-aid solution that ultimately wouldn't solve anything. And the fact is, there comes a times where you just have to cut your losses and start over, start fresh. And I think Doctor Who has reached that point. Doctor Who has reached the point where it's just time to basically everything from 2005 until now, ignore all of that, wipe the slate clean, and start again, and this time do it properly and do it right. So, the question is, how do you do it right? Well, if a reboot of the current Doctor Who did happen, it could happen any number of ways, and we could go about speculating about that from now until the end, until the crack of doom, frankly. So, instead of doing that, I'll just focus on the only thing I really can focus on at that point, and that is how I would do a Doctor Who series if by some miracle, either I was there back in 2005 when I was a producer, or if I became a producer tomorrow, like I said before, and somehow got hold of the rights to Doctor Who, as I said earlier on in this presentation. And I'll focus on the latter possibility, because out of the two, that's basically the lesser of two impossibilities, really. And so I'll focus on that one, how I would do a reboot of Doctor Who. Now, in my reboot, there'll be so many changes and alterations from the current series that if I went into every single one of them, this video would be hours long, and frankly, the idea of that wearies me. So I'll not focus on that, because also most of the changes I meant would be largely cosmetic to varying degrees, and so therefore they wouldn't make a whole lot of difference in the long run. So, like I said, I'll not focus on those. But there are four primary differences that I would make to the current series of Doctor Who that would fundamentally change the landscape of the series. And those changes are as follows. My first course of action would be to reinstate Paul McGann as the 8th Doctor, for at least one season, maybe more. I'm guessing his duration of the show would be dependent on a couple of factors. The first of which being is if the fans responded well to him, which, given the huge outcry of positivity that took place when he appeared in the Doctor Who special Night of the Doctor, I can't imagine why they wouldn't. And the other factor would be, is it how long Paul himself wanted to remain in the role. Now, my reasons for bringing the Eighth Doctor back would be, one, because he'd be able to act as a kind of a bridge between the original series and the new series, and act as an intermediary between the two of them, and basically blend the two of them together, so there'd be that connection there. And then there's also the fact that it would enable me to reference some of the fantastic adventures that took place during the Wilderness years. Like, for example, there was the original adventures done by Big Finish during the Eighth Doctor run. I mean, all the adventures were in Big Finish were all incredible, but for me, the Eighth Doctor adventures were particularly memorable. I really enjoyed them. And it would also enable me to reference some of the adventures that were done in, actually all of the adventures that were done in the Eighth Doctor comic strip in Doctor Who magazine. Because what's brilliant about that magazine is there are two things that are really fantastic about it. And one is the fact that before that point, the Doctor Who comic strip had been kind of more or less dependent on the series for its inspiration, and it only had a certain level of creativity because it was sort of bound to the Doctor Who series that was running, the TV series that was running at the same time, and that's the reason why the previous comic strip, the Seventh Doctor comic book strip, was really inconsistent and really all over the place. It was a jumbled mess. But when the Eighth comic book strip came along, for the first time, they didn't have to worry about binding it to an existing show. So they enabled the show to really shape its own destiny and spread its wings, while at the same time keeping a cohesive storyline from point A to point B, which I think was just brilliant. And the other reason why is because of probably one of my favourite companions of all time that was introduced during the comic book strip, who is, of course, Izzy. Now, Izzy is probably, as far as I'm concerned, one of the best companions in Doctor Who ever. I think she's right up there with Sarah Jane Smith, who is arguably one of the most iconic companions of the classic era, really. And I think Izzy is on her level. She's a very different character than Sarah Jane Smith, but she's just a brilliant character in my book, and I think she's just absolutely excellent. And so, yeah, I definitely would like to reference some of those adventures. Now, I know you're probably wondering a couple of things right now. One is, how would I reference them? Well, that's simple. What I'd do is, I'd have in the storyline is that all those adventures and all those scenarios that took place in Big Finish and Doctor Who magazine, what they could have done, they could have taken place in the Eighth Doctor's past, like in between the point where the 1996 TV movie ended and the new series begins. All those adventures that you see in the Big Finish productions were all taking place in that time. We didn't see them on television. We saw them, or we experienced them through the medium of audio adventures and a comic book. So same adventure, different medium. You see? Now, and I suppose also some of you are also wondering why I would reference only the Big Finish productions and the comic book, and not reference why I didn't mention the original novels by Virgin and BBC Books. Well, the reason why I haven't referenced them yet is because that actually leads me into the next big change that I would make in the reboot of Doctor Who, and that is this. I would make the new series of Doctor Who much darker and much scarier, and I would in fact model it after the original novels by Virgin in the New and Missing Adventures, and later on in the original adventures by BBC Books. And I'd even go so far as to actually adapt some of those original adventures and some of those novels, assuming, of course, I could secure the rights to them. Like, for example, one thing I'd love to be able to do is get a chance to adapt the Time Worm saga. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with this, I won't spoil it for you in case you want to check it out, provided, of course, you can find the books. There are copies available on places like eBay and Amazon, so if you find a copy which doesn't break the bank, then all well and good. But basically, the story starts in the book Time Worm Genesis, which basically concerns the Seventh Doctor, who at that time was the current Doctor and Ace, who visit ancient Mesopotamia. And there, they discover that an alien is actually living amongst them and has set herself up as a goddess. And basically, at some point towards I believe the end of the story, the alien, she actually manages to get inside the TARDIS, and because she is partly cybernetic, she actually absorbs some of the Time Lord technology, and hence develops the ability to time travel. And in doing so, becomes this apocalyptic super being called the Time Worm. And what this starts is a basic game of cat and mouse, where the Doctor is chasing the Time Worm throughout history and trying to repair the damage it does as it goes. And it leads to all kinds of very interesting stories and very interesting scenarios. Like the Doctor, for example, he actually befriends Hitler at one point, which was somewhat controversial, but interesting idea. Because of basically normally it is something he would never do, but the circumstances are dire enough for it to warrant such a course of action. And the story ultimately culminates in a final showdown between the Doctor and the Time Worm, the details of which, like I said, I will not reveal here because I don't want to spoil it for anyone. But let's say it's an incredible saga, and I think be able to adapt it for the Eighth Doctor and whoever his companion would be, or companions, possible, would be it'd be a joy, a labor of love, really. I'd love to do that. There are other adventures I'd like to get a hold of, and one of them would be Lung Barrows, which was actually written by the same guys who wrote the aforementioned Ghostlight. And Lung Barrows is a really fascinating story because it actually basically focuses on the Doctor's past and this ancestral home of the Doctor, which he actually despises. He hates the place. He never, it's part of the reason why he left Gallifrey, I think. And he just, this place that basically haunts the Doctor even to this day, and he really just cannot stand it, and he's forced to go back and confront his own personal demons in this house. And it's almost it's like a haunted house story, in a way, on Gallifrey, an alien haunted house story. I mean, what a brilliant idea is that? I mean, that's incredible. A Time Lord ghost story of sorts. And there were others I would have adapted if I got the rights to them, but now probably I think I'd pass over, sadly. For example, the story Bloodheat here, which is actually probably one of my favourite novels of the Virgin New Adventures that was ever produced. And it's just an excellent story, and it's absolutely fascinating because it deals with an alternative timeline. Basically, what's happened is that someone has interfered with the course of history, where at the point where the Silurians first emerged from their hibernation in the story, in the third Doctor story, the Silurians, and as a result, it's created an alternative Earth where the entire planet is dominated by the Silurians once more. They've returned the environment to its original state when they first went into hibernation. So you've got all these prehistoric plants and pine trees growing all over the place, and also dinosaurs roaming around everywhere. And at the top of all this, there's the Silurians, and the humans are almost all but extinct. They're like an endangered species. There's a few holdouts here and there who are basically in a desperate struggle to fight back against the Silurians, which are led by the remnants of Unit and the Brigadier. However, there's a reason why adapting this story now would not be possible, and that reason is this: two of the actors who played principal characters in that adventure are sadly no longer with us. One of which is, of course, Nicholas Courtney, who played the ever-reliable Brigadier, and the other is Carolyn John, who played Liz Shaw, who is also a major character in this adventure, and both of the actors are gone now, I'm very sorry to say, and so therefore doing an adaptation now just wouldn't be possible, because you couldn't get anyone else to play those characters, because if you did recast them, it would be frankly not only rather insulting to them, but also, besmirch the memory of the characters, and also quite insulting to the actors themselves. And so sadly, as much as I would love to adapt Blood Heat, the circumstances, it's just not possible. Because even if you did it with a different group of characters, other than the Brigadier and Liz Shaw, it still wouldn't work, because the original story was tied very closely to the original emergence of the Silurians in the Third Doctor adventure, and therefore their presence there would be a major necessity. And so with them gone, with the actors who played them gone, it's just, it's just not possible. It's not practical to bring it back. So sadly, there's no way that Blood Heat could be adapted, as much as I would love to do it. But it's not just the Virgin adventures that I'd adapt into TV shows if I could, once again, if I could get the rights to them. Like, for example, there's a whole bunch of the original BBC stories I'd love to do. Like, one would be, of course, the story Storm Harvest. If those of you who haven't read Storm Harvest, it's a really good one. I highly recommend you check that out. Another one I'd like to do would be War of the Daleks. I'd love to do War of the Daleks, or an adaptation of it, if I could get the rights to it. Another one would be Illegal Alien, which is a really good Cyberman adventure set during the London Blitz. And another one I'd love to do would be Relative Dimensions. Now, as far as I know, Relative Dimensions is not a classic in the original adventures, but personally, I think it's really good because it deals with some really fascinating themes. The first being is the fact that it focuses on some really strong ideas, and it also really explores the Doctor's relationship to Unit, which is actually not what you might expect it to be. Like, granted, the Doctor has got friends among Unit. Like, there's the Brigadier and Sergeant Benton and Mike Yates and all of them. But there's also a lot of other characters in Unit that we don't get to be, like the General Infantry, the everyday soldiers. Now, apparently this book discusses the idea that these guys, they don't like him very much. And the reason why is because every time the Doctor gets involved, all hell breaks loose. And usually when that happens, people end up dying. And so a lot of Unit soldiers in the General Infantry, like the general, grunts and whatnot, a lot of them have actually lost friends and colleagues because of the situations when the Doctor got involved. And every time he's in there, there's always a very high casualty count. And so as a result, he's not very popular among the average ranks in the unit, and a lot of them don't like him for that reason, which I found a really interesting idea. And I think that's the reason. That's one of the reasons why I think Relative Dementias would make a really good TV story, as would all the other original novels that I've already mentioned here. And another aspect of the Wilderness Years novels that I'd love to get a chance to introduce to the reboot would be the character Bernice Summerfield. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with Bernice, she's in some regards, she's almost like the Wilderness Years equivalent of River Song, only she's vastly superior to River Song as far as I'm concerned. She's actually a human archaeologist who comes from the future, and she ends up traveling with the Doctor as a regular member of his crew. Now, she becomes one of his companions, and she's not exactly what I call the best companion of all times, but still I think she's a really good companion. She was certainly very popular. Like, she was so popular, in fact, that she even got her own series in the Big Finish audio adventures. So yeah, I think I'd definitely love to bring her into the reboot. I'd either bring her in as a all-out character who travels with the Doctor regularly, or I'd bring her in as a character who had previously traveled with the Doctor at some point during the show's hiatus, and therefore she knows the Doctor. So when the two of them meet, they recognize each other. So she'd either be a regular on the show, or she'd be a character who appears every now and then, like once in a blue moon. And so that'd be one element I'd like to bring into the reboot. Now, that's not to say that everything I do in the reboot would be adapted from an already existing piece of work. I'd also try and inject as much originality in there as possible. I'd like to come up with a whole bunch of new storylines and new adventures and new characters, and just really just take them in as many directions as I could, and just really explore the universe of Doctor Who, and really just take it by the teeth and run with it. But even so, like I said before, it just would seem to me be a waste to have all these fantastic adventures that were produced during the show's hiatus and not take advantage of them, not like try and use them and bring them into the fold, as it were. Because that's something that another thing that the current series done, which I really disapprove of and I really cannot stand, is the fact they more or less ignored the Wilderness Years novels, which I absolutely despise, because these novels were one of the key elements that kept the flame of Doctor Who burning while the show was off the air. And then to simply just be dismissed like this, willy-nilly, is incredibly insulting. And I think it's an outrage, really. So that's another reason why I try and bring them into the fold, as well as doing as much and as many original stories as I possibly could. And there is another reason why I would go for a darker and grimmer tone in a new series Doctor Who, and that is because of a point that Colin Baker once made, which I wholeheartedly agreed with, and that was this: when you have a character who's wandering around finding the alien scum of the universe week after week, then the alien scum has to do a little bit more than say boo and go away. They actually have to be a credible threat. And this was a opinion that Colin Baker had, and I couldn't agree with him more, frankly. And that's something the current series has apparently forgotten. They've forgotten the fact that Doctor Who always had a certain level of fear in there. There was always a certain level of like horror, and there was a reason why kids were hiding behind the sofa when they were watching this. It's because it was scary. It was terrifying. And that's what I try and do. I want to put the kids back behind the sofa. I want to really kind of terrify them. And that's another problem that the current series has done, is they've sort of like over-sanitizing Doctor Who. And I know that Doctor Who, being a somewhat a family orientated show, there has to be a certain level of sanitation there. I don't deny that. But the problem with the current series is they overdo it. And it's like they're trying to polish every idea they come up with, and so no one can get caught on it, no one can get nicked on it. And try not to scare anyone. The thing is, Doctor Who has got to be scary. It's supposed to be scary, and to not make it scary is just not. It's basically betraying the essence of what the show is. And it's also kind of a waste of time, because anything that they think they're protecting the children from, couldn't be anything worse that they've already experienced or already seen playing, I don't know, something on their Xbox or PlayStation 4 or whatever, or something they might have seen on the internet, or even just watched on another TV show or a movie. So in the end, they're not really protecting them for anything. They're just like denying themselves the content that the show should have. And as a result, this new kind of like play it safe direction that they're going in, it doesn't come off as the right thing to do. It doesn't come off as the moral thing to do, or even the smart thing to do. What it comes off as is a load of pretentious, outdated, Mary Whitehousean bullshit. Anyway, moving on. Now we get to the third change that I would make, and that is I would re-implement the multi-episode format to the series, not just for occasional adventures, but for every adventure, every single story in the series we made up of multi-episodes, like it originally was. Now, having said that, I am partially aware of the reasons why the multi-episode format was abandoned in the current series, because they were trying to get the show out there more efficiently and more quickly to cope with the tight schedules on which television is produced these days. But even so, there were other ways of achieving that without having to almost completely sacrifice one of the key elements that made the classic series great, which was, of course, the multi-episode format and the subsequent cliffhangers that resulted from them. And how I would do this is thusly. I would adopt the same format as the classic series did during its 22nd season, which was the first full season of the Sixth Doctor, Colin Baker. Now, what they did here was they changed the series, which up until that point had been made up of adventures which were broken up into anywhere between 4 to a maximum of 6 25-minute long episodes. And then what they did was, in the 22nd season, is they changed that to anywhere between 2 to a maximum of 3 45-minute long episodes. And so essentially what they did was they took 2 of the 25-minute long episodes and merged them into one. Now, I know the math doesn't quite add up in that equation, but that is the basic idea of what they did. They essentially did change the format to halve the running time that the show was on the air. And I'd adopt that same format because it would enable the show to still be produced in a expeditious fashion, while at the same time preserving the multi-episode format. And why? Because it's worth preserving. The episodic adventures in Doctor Who and the cliffhangers that resulted had so many fantastic moments and so much enjoyment to be had over the years that it's worth holding on to. And that is why it would be the third and probably the most important change that I would make to the new series. And now we come to the fourth and final change that I would make to the reboot of Doctor Who, and that is I would completely eliminate the storyline of the Time War. Don't like it, don't need it, don't want it, get rid of it. Now, why would I do that? Well, that's because the fact is, Gallifrey had so much potential and so much possibilities for ideas tied up in it that the sky was literally the limit. But now, because of the Time War, the Time War saga, all that potential is gone, wasted. It's just stupid, because there are so many potential characters and fellow Time Lords the Doctor could have met and interacted with, which would have been fantastic. Like, for example, You've got the Doctor's old archenemy, the Master, who, even though the Master has appeared in the current series, frankly, the adventures he's been in have not been all that great, and so, to get him in a new series after the series is put back on track would be fantastic. I'd love to do that. Another character the Doctor can meet is another old enemy of his, the meddling monk, or Morpheus, which is his real name. Now, this character only appeared in the series twice, in the actual TV series. Like, he appeared once in the Time Meddler, which is actually where he got the nickname Meddling Monk, because he was a Time Lord disguised as a monk during that particular adventure. He was planning to alter the course of Earth's history. And the other time he appeared was during a storyline called The Dalek Master Plan. And even though those were only 2 TV appearances, but he did appear several other times during the original novels and the Big Finish production. So he has been seen before. And then you have another character, which is, of course, the Doctor's former friend and now enemy, Lord President Barusa. Now, granted, Barusa was actually imprisoned in a statue at the end of the 5 Doctors. But even so, there could still be a possibility for him to come back. It's it's not it's not something you could completely rule out. And then, of course, you've got characters who are not enemies of the Doctor, like Romana, for example. Like, Romana is a fantastic character. She's she even became the Lord President of Gallifrey. She's right now she's actually now the leader of the High Council of Time Lords. So if there's not potential for story there, I know what is. Because I'd love to bring Romana back. Cause that'd be a lot of fun, I think. And once again, you've also got the Doctor's granddaughter, Susan. Now, we know she was left on Earth at the end of the Dalek invasion of Earth. But who's to say that she won't ever rejoin the Doctor? I mean, she might go back to Gallifrey, or who knows? Maybe she could come back to the TARDIS and end up traveling with the Doctor again. Maybe in a new incarnation. Maybe she regenerates. I mean, she's a Time Lord after all. I mean, that'd be, the possibilities there are vast. And heading back onto villains again, you've got of course, Omega, who is not strictly a Time Lord anymore. He's actually more of an antimatter being. But, he's a really interesting character because he's sort of like the tragic villain. He kind of reminds me of kind of the Phantom of the Opera in a way. Like, he's kind of this character who is in this situation which isn't really his fault. And so he's sort of like, he's a bad guy, but he's a bad guy that you sympathize with. And so there's definitely a lot of potential for his character because his story and the events that led him to becoming what he is are very closely tied to the history of Gallifrey. And so that'd be a really interesting possibility to look into, I think. Another really great villain to bring into the story would be the Rani, because the Rani is one of my favourite Time Lord villains that the series ever produced. Like, she's right there with the Master, in my opinion, because she's very unlike the Master. Like, whereas the Master is interested in power and universal domination, she's more interested in science for the sake of knowledge, really. So in many ways she's a lot like the Doctor in that regard, only she doesn't have anywhere near as many principles as he has. Like, she basically sees the pursuit of truth is the only concern, and the pursuit of knowledge. And she's willing to do whatever she has to get that done. So she's not like Joseph Mengele in that regard, and various other like infamous scientists have been around over the ages. And that, to me, makes her a very interesting character. Because the Doctor has dealt with themes like that before, not just in the Rani, but also in the case of Magnus Greel, who was the main villain of the Talons of Wayne-Chiang, another really good villain. So, for that reason, I think she'd be an excellent addition to the new series. And also, there's the fact that the fans have been asking for her return for a number of years now, so I say, give it to them. Why not? If she's a great character, bring her in. And then, of course, we have the character Morbius. Now, Morbius is also a character who's a villainous Time Lord who appeared in the story of the Brain of Morbius, and he was supposedly destroyed at the end of that. But still, I can't believe that he's gone forever. I think the possibility that he could come back could be really interesting. And in fact, there was an idea that I had that I would in fact have Morbius tied to the reasons why the Doctor left Gallifrey. Now, as for what they are, I'll get to them in a moment, but I'll tell you that later. But it's an idea I had which could be implemented in the new series, which I won't go into details to, but I will give you a basic rundown of it. Now, as I told you before, I had this idea where Morbius was very closely tied to the reasons why the Doctor actually left Gallifrey. Now, I'll get onto that now. Actually, now I won't tell you in detail, but I'll just give you a basic rundown because I want to keep the specifics to myself. But this is actually inspired by several hints that the classic series gave throughout the course of the entire series, back from the 60s all the way through until now, or at least until the end of the classic series, which was back in 1989. Like, for example, we all know part of the reason why the Doctor left Gallifrey was because he'd grown tired of the Time Lord lifestyle, and he just couldn't stand the thought of being tied to this mundane, monotonous existence any longer. But I remember thinking, is that the only reason why he left Gallifrey? Or was there something else? Was there another reason why he chose to basically abandon his planet? And you get, and often throughout the series, you get the sense that there was something else at play here, because one is the fact that the Doctor is often very reticent to talk about his past on Gallifrey, and he's even less willing to talk about his family. Like, he usually gets very uncomfortable or very evasive about the subject. I remember thinking, why? Why is that? And one of the hints you get was during the storyline, the Tomb of the Cybermen, where the Doctor was talking to his companion Victoria, and Victoria said, "Being so old, you probably don't even remember your family." To which the Doctor replied, "Oh yes, I do. If I want to. That's the key, you see. I actually want to bring them back in front of my eyes. Otherwise, they sleep in my mind and I forget." Now I remember thinking, why would he want to forget? Why would he want to forget his family? Is it because he's just too busy and he's got too much on his plate to remember them all the time? Or is it something else? Is there another reason why he would rather forget what happened? And I'm guessing that something terrible must have happened when he was on Gallifrey. Something horrible. So horrible that he'd rather not remember the specifics of it. He'd rather just put it out of his mind and focus on other things. And this is also inspired by another moment where the fourth Doctor was talking to Adric, and he was explaining the reasons why the chameleon circuit didn't work, and that was because he actually stole the TARDIS before the Time Lords had a chance to do the chameleon conversion. So the chameleon circuit never actually functioned properly, and that's the reason why it ultimately ended up getting stuck as a police box, and never changed from that point on. Now, what he said to Adric, or what Adric said to the Doctor was, "I thought you said she was yours." To which the Doctor replied, "Well, on a finders keepers sort of basis, yes. I should have waited until they did the chameleon conversion. There were other pressing reasons at the time." And once again, I remember wondering, what were those pressing reasons? What was so important that he couldn't wait for them to do the chameleon conversion? Which was a key element of a TARDIS's traveling, the ability to blend in. And like I said, there are several other hints here and there throughout the series. But I suspect the reason why is because, like I said before, something horrible happened. Something so terrible. This horrible event took place, and the Doctor was only able to save himself and his granddaughter Susan, and that's the reason why the two of them ended up traveling together. And it could also explain why the first Doctor was actually somewhat ruthless in a weird sort of way, because you noticed he was often willing to do things that were quite questionable to downright, almost cruel. Like, for example, there was one point during the first Dalek story when they went down to explore the city, which is actually the Dalek city on Skaro. Of course, at the time they had no idea the Daleks were there, and the character Barbara had become separated from them. And in between the time that they were there, the Doctor also discovered that that Skaro's atmosphere was polluted by a very high level of fallout, and they'd been wandering around in it completely unprotected, and so they were suffering from radiation sickness. And so the Doctor said that he and Susan were going to go back to the ship, and he was perfectly happy to leave Barbara and Ian to search for him on his own, and essentially abandon them, both of them there, to die of radiation sickness to protect Susan. So I remember thinking, why would he do that unless something happened that would make him very protective of Susan? And so therefore, I imagine it was tied up with his reasons why he left Gallifrey. Which brings me to Morbius. Now, Morbius, as some of you I'm sure you're aware, was actually once the leader of the High Council of the Time Lords. He was once the Lord President of Gallifrey. And so, I imagine his rule must have been a pretty tyrannical one, given his reputation. And so therefore, I imagine that anyone who stood up against him met a rather unpleasant end, or something terrible happened to them. And this is the point I'm getting at. While Gallifrey was under Morbius's rules, was under Morbius's control, the Doctor's family suffered this horrible fate, and the Doctor was only able to save himself and Susan. And that's the reason why he never goes back. Why he doesn't want to go back. And every time he does go back to Gallifrey, he's so desperate to get away from there. It's not because he's bored there or because it's monotonous, but because there's just too many bad memories there, because this terrible event that took place. That was the basic rundown of my idea for what happened to the Doctor's family. Now, there's a lot more detail than that, but like I said, I won't go into that now. But that's another change I'll make to the new series of Doctor Who. And that's the reason why getting rid of the Time War will be one of the key changes, and also a very important change that I would make to a Doctor Who reboot. I also firmly believe that if there was ever a time to make this happen, to bring Doctor Who back to the glorious show that it once was, and put it back on track, it is now. For two main reasons. One is because of the hiatus the show's going to be taking over this year, and the fact that there's going to be a new production team coming in. That's one reason why, because it's an opportunity to basically, bring it back to what it was, to cut their losses and start again. And the other reason is because of the current climate of media at the moment, because there's reboots everywhere. Like, you've got the reboot of Star Trek by J.J. Abrams. Like, 2 movies have already been made, and the third one, I believe, is coming out this year, even though that one's not going to be directed by J.J. Abrams, because he's tied up with Star Wars at the moment, which in itself is more or less a reboot. I know that The Force Awakens isn't technically a reboot. It's not redoing it exactly, but it does more or less gloss over the events of the prequel trilogy. Because if you've watched it, you notice it only references the original trilogy and not a word or a whisper to the prequel trilogy, which is understandable because, well, the less said about those 3 movies, the better. We all know what happened there. And then, of course, you've got the reboot of Aliens franchise coming along. Because apparently Alien 5, which is not going to be the final title, apparently, which is scheduled to be directed by Neil Blomkamp, is a direct sequel to the second film, Aliens. It essentially ignores the events of Alien 3, which I think is a brilliant decision, because Alien 3 it's awful. It's a terrible movie. I mean, visually it's great. It's got some impressive special effects and a good musical score. Yeah, sure, but story-wise, it's a travesty. It's an abomination. Because not only is it an incredibly insulting slap in the face to its predecessor, and also the fans that invested in that movie, but also it's essentially a dead rip-off of the first movie. All they did was remake Alien and then just fudge the facts a bit. Only they didn't do it to anywhere near as brilliant a level as Ridley Scott did. So, who wouldn't want to reboot that? So, in the light of those events, I think it is ever a time to reboot Doctor Who and bring it back to what it was, or at least bring it back to a more faithful interpretation of what it should be. I think now is that time. Alright, I'm just about to round up here. Before I go, if any of you out there have got any questions or want to express your opinion, if you agree with me or disagree, if you have an opposing opinion, by all means let me know. I'm interested to hear what you have to say. If you wish to criticise what I've put out here anyway, by all means do so, as long as the criticism is constructive in nature. If you're just going to criticize my work just for the sake of attacking it, then don't bother, because your comment will be blocked. Just letting you know. And to you Doctor Who fans out there, I say this. If my words here today have meant nothing, if you're perfectly happy to let the Doctor Who series continue as it is, then fine, go ahead. That's your prerogative. I just want to get to know, as far as I'm concerned, you're selling out a series that you vainly claim to love. That's what I think you're doing. And frankly, you do so with my utter contempt. But if any of you see as I see, if anything I've said here today has struck a chord, then maybe there's a chance. Because the fact is, if Doctor Who is allowed to remain in this situation and basically sit in this kind of self-defeating cul-de-sac that's been basically wedged into, there's quite possible the series will disappear again. And as the Master himself once said, the cosmos without the Doctor scarcely bears thinking about.